Hi everyone, thank you for having a look at this video, listening to my story about what happened between myself and Engineered Performance Racing that resulted in me having to sue him, take him to court, having a 5-day jury trial and winning. Bit about me, I'm sure you've probably seen my name about. I've been in the Z scene since 2004. I've had this one. This is my 95 Jap import twin turbo manual. I've owned since 2008. And I've been part of the UK Z scene since 2004. Helped organise events and yeah, been around for a little while. So sadly, this isn't my first rodeo when it comes to problematic Z engines. As I said, yeah, the reason why I'm here is to tell you all what happened, and I know there's been, myself, I've kind of hidden a lot of the stuff that has gone on for a number of reasons, but I feel my hand has been forced now that I've got to kind of share my story, which started back in 2018. So in November 2018, I contracted Engineered Performance Racing, dealing with Mitch Wilson, the owner of that business, to build me a fully forged engine of high spec. The idea was to build an engine that was capable of 900,000 horsepower, with my actual goal being around the 600 horsepower mark, to keep the engine under stress, to get some longevity, to run it at 60-70% of its capability. So it would survive. So I paid Mitch up front, because obviously I'm over in the UK, show him willing as a good customer. And the initial payment that I made was just over $17,000. And that included Mitch supplying a block and a crank, and then I bought a load of parts through him, so CP pistons, sines rods, EPR's billet main cap kits, EPR's sump, and then kind of the build spec over the months kind of was changed and tweaked to include their CNC porting program, so heads and lower plenum, ceramic and diamondized coating of turbos, manifolds, pistons, basically the whole shebang. And I think the final bill was just above $20,000 all in. I sent a load of my stuff over, so I already had a set of 48p heads out of this car that I'd already fitted Supertech valve train to. I'd already had some mild porting, so I sent those over, and then everything else that was kind of needed to make a full build. It's all like rocker covers, backing plates, front covers, manis, like everything that was needed to basically make a complete long block bar the upper plenum. I had a bit of concern about my 48p heads. In my lifetime with the car, they'd been milled twice. So I had a bit of concern that they would have enough thickness in them to survive another skim. I didn't think they needed another skim because the previous engine hadn't blown a head gasket. It had suffered rod knock. So I expressed this concern to Mitch I think on 5 occasions in total I've got messages for, and every time Mitch said, not a problem, they'll be fine, more than serviceable. It didn't make any sense to me to pay for the whole CNC porting on a set of heads that weren't going to be usable because they'd been overly skimmed. See me looking down, I've got a load of notes. So yeah, that was end of 2018. I got the engine 16th September 2019 is when I received the engine, and there were issues immediately. The first issue was the dipstick. So when I was putting the rest of the engine together, putting all the ancillaries, power steering, alternator, AC, reinstalled the dipstick, reinstalled dipstick tube, put dipstick in, went to pull it out, and it was stuck, and it was completely caught on something internally, which was the girdle for the billet main caps. Gave dipstick another pull, and the end weight, so the bit where you measure the oil, had come clean off the cable. So let EPR know, let Mitch know. He gave me the go ahead to remove the sump, retrieve the bit of metal floating around on the inside, and to do a bit of clearancing on the girdle to give me a bit of room so it didn't snag again. Bit of a design flaw. Don't know if it was ever rectified in the other versions of the kit, but that was the first issue. The second issue I had was after reinstalling the engine, put all the fluids in, put the coolant in, and all the coolant fell out the bottom of the engine because Mitch had forgot to put the coolant drain bungs that sit kind of underneath the at the bottom of the block under the turbos. Forgot to put the bungs back in. Nothing. Yeah. So that wasted a whole bunch of coolant. Third issue was I'd bought the Ross performance trigger kit, but at the time Ross didn't make a crank pulley harmonic balancer with the AC provision for cars rated over 600 horsepower. So I used, with Mitch, we decided on an ATI damper, and then he would make a trigger wheel to go on the damper. Fortunately, that caused clearance and alignment issues. So the alternator, water pump just about lined up. The power steering pulley wouldn't line up. It was completely off by a rib, effectively. And the viscous fan hit the front of the harmonic damper and took chunks off the inside of the viscous fan. That issue didn't get sorted until the engine went back to EPR the first time, which I'll get onto shortly. The final issue that I had was while priming the oil system, the cam covers started immediately leaking. So when I took the top end of the engine off, the intake side, obviously you've got the crosshead screws, and then there's a crush washer that's meant to sit underneath them. Mitch hadn't used the OEM ones. He'd used just some rubber washers, effectively, that to me didn't appear to be loading the cam cover properly to make an effective seal. So I ended up getting some more and sealing that back up properly. And then after it was installed, I had a number of conversations with Mitch and EPR about the running in. So when I got the engine, it came with a build sheet which had a lot of the specifications on it, a lot of the measurements, a warranty document, and a running in procedures document. My plan, which Mitch agreed to, was I'd have the car transported to a place with a hub dyno, and a running in procedure would be done on the dyno. I'm kind of the school of thought that engines should be running hard as they're intended to be used. Mitch, from recollection, had that same belief. So yeah, we had an agreement that I'd run it in on the engine dyno, do a couple of oil changes, sorry, not engine dyno, on the hub dyno, do a couple of oil changes while it was there, and then proceed on to the full tuning. So I was on Haltech Platinum then at the time. So I transported the engine over to a company called Lloyd Specialist Developments. You might have seen them recently on Bob Genie's Beast build for his time attack car. That's where I took the car originally. They did what they normally do. Strapped it on the dyno, did the usual pre-dyno checks, you know, make sure it's got no leaks, boost leak test, check the base timing, all was normal, and then went for it first, the engine's first start. I hadn't started it. I wanted the first start to be on the engine on the hub dyno with the tuner present, so they could make. I know Haltech's base maps are pretty good, but you know, plain safe. Wanted a tuner there to be able to make any adjustments that were needed. And the engine didn't start. In fact, it just span and span and span. We checked everything. I think I had a couple of wires round the wrong way from where I'd wired in the trigger system. Changed that. Again, kept trying, nothing. So contacted EPR, let them know. We had some question of checking whether the cam timing was correct. So part of the build, something else with the build was I had EPR's Genesis cams to go on top of my Supertech valve train, and then I had BDE adjustable pulleys, intake and exhaust. So I left the car with Lloyd's, and then cam timing was checked, and then a compression test was done, and the compression test revealed 0 PSI compression across all 6 cylinders. A leak down test was then done, and that found that intake and exhaust was all leaking. It had bent all its valves. The engine hadn't even run. As soon as it had turned over, it had bent all its valves. So yeah, made my first warranty claim with EPR. They were super apologetic. Sorry about the noise. Yeah, Mitch was super apologetic. He had his business partner, whose name I can't remember, on the call with me. They weren't sure how it had happened, but they'd clearly made a mistake. They, you know, said, please keep this off social media. I think there had been some other stuff on social media about EPR that was shining them in a negative light. And I agreed. You know, they went hands up. It couldn't have been anybody else's fault but theirs. And they said, you know, get it shipped back to us. We'll look after you. We'll make sure we get it sorted. You'll be treated as priority. You know, don't worry, it'll get sorted. So, took the engine out. This would have been, when was it at Lloyd's? It was at Lloyd Specialist Developments at the end of August, beginning of September. I had the engine out pretty quick, but there was a load of paperwork I had to do this side because being a temporary export and all the import-export rules that went along with it. So it got shipped just before Christmas, and Mitch received it on the 6th of January. And then didn't open the box until the 6th of March, 2 months later. So that kind of gave me some warnings about how I might be treated. It didn't certainly feel like I was being treated like a priority. So yeah, Mitch eventually had a look at the engine, stripped it down and found that, yeah, it had bent all of its valves. And we had a few conversations about kind of moving forwards. It makes sense for him to just repair it and send it back, and me hope that it wasn't going to do the same again. And kind of through the regular conversation that we were having, Mitch had expressed his desire to put a VG on an engine dyno. He hadn't seen it done in the States before. I thought it was this gave a perfect opportunity to do that, to get an engine on an engine dyno, A lot of people at the time were saying, you know, obviously Mitch's engines aren't proven, his cams aren't proven. I thought, well, this is a good opportunity, obviously, for him to prove his work, and for me to have an engine running on an engine dyno out there, knowing that I was going to get an engine back that would be fully functional. So we agreed that I'd obviously pay for the dyno time. I pay for the tune, which obviously Matt Paul, who some of you may know, who runs Wind Factory, he was friends with Mitch. I was friendly with Matt, comfortable enough that I was happy for him to kind of do a tune for me on an engine dyno. So we came to an agreement that Matt was going to map the car on the engine dyno. And things kind of progressed from there. So that agreement was in place. Obviously COVID hit April 2020, which slowed some things down for Mitch to be able to get the parts and bits that he needed to be able to adapt to VG, to put it on an engine dyno. He was going to use the one at Rare Morrison Racing. So there was a bit of delay there. Had another bit of a shock when I received the bill from Mitch and EPR for all the conversion, like the bell housing, coolant pipes, front mount indicator, intercooler, all the stuff that he needed to use to put the VG on an engine dyno. My perspective was, I wasn't going to pay for that. That was Mitch investing in his business. That was parts that he would be able to put on any VG going forward, to put on an engine dyno and do as he would like. That, none of that stuff was going to get shipped to me, and even if it did, it was useless to me. What am I going to do with a load of stuff to adapt a VG to an engine dyno? I don't own an engine dyno. So there was a bit of a disagreement there, but that got resolved. That I'd pay for the dyno time and the tuning, Mitch would pay for everything else. So I believe, oh yeah, something else that I'd asked for. Obviously, because it bent all its valves, and I mentioned earlier that obviously I got a build sheet with all the numbers on for all the clearances. One of the measurements that was missing was piston to valve clearance. So I'd asked Mitch, obviously as it's clear, you know, it's bent all of its valves. When you check and measure piston to valve clearance, can I have those numbers to add to my build sheet? I never got those numbers. As far as I can tell, that measurement was never made. If it was, I was never given the information or any form of proof that it had been done. So fast forward to December, I believe. Yeah, 1st of December 2020. The engine eventually went onto the engine dyno. Matt Paul had made a body harness, like, you know, a replica of a body harness to kind of to keep the Haltech happy. Engine was installed, and then I get a phone call. So me, Matt, and Mitch had a WhatsApp group. So obviously I could get live updates of what was happening, and if things started going well, they could do a video call and I could watch the engine dyno process. So I think as a loader you would be, if your engine's allegedly the first VG on an engine dyno in the States, it's kind of that's a cool thing to be part of. So I wanted to be involved as I could be. And then they tried starting the engine, and I get a phone call from Mitch to say my turbos are goosed. They're pouring oil out the front and rear of the turbos. So these are Z1 GT525s that I'd owned since about 2012. They'd done no more than 10,000 miles, I would guess, at 18 PSI tops. No, 21 PSI. I hadn't had a hard life at all. I had no previous issues with them blowing smoke or anything like that. Nothing to suggest there was anything mechanically wrong with them. So I was a little bit surprised. Mitch said that he'd go shoot back to EPR to grab another set of turbos so we could continue with the engine dyno, but obviously my tune wouldn't be perfect, but the car would be running, the engine would be running. And then it didn't make sense to me why these would be gushing oil out the front of the rear of the turbos. So I gave Matt a ring, who was still at the engine dyno, and said, he's not left the bung in the drain of the turbos, has he? The turbos are draining, aren't they? And Matt went and duly checked and found both turbos still had bungs that Mitch had installed into them to prevent them leaking during transport. Still in there, installed, plumbed in. But yeah, so no doubt shortened the life of my turbos by forcing oil out the front and rear of the turbo housings. Maybe not, maybe so, I don't know. So I wasn't overly impressed with that. So they tried starting it. I know Matt had a couple of issues with the trigger system. So the Ross setup and Mitch's trigger wheel had been installed at this point. I'd sent my original harness out with the engine on return because I've got a brand new harness, Nissan harness in this from a factory that I'd adapted this side for the trigger kit and my injector dynamics injectors. But my original loom that came out of the car already had like the ID injector pigtails on it, and I'd sent a couple of DTM connectors so Matt could wire in the trigger kit. So we had some issues there, and then I think they went back to the original CAS because they couldn't get a trigger signal. Once that got sorted, again, they kept trying to start it, no start. And we were going through fault finding, make sure that injector settings were right, timing was set right, all the usual stuff you do for a non-starting car. And then I had a bit of a gut feeling that this is sounding all a bit familiar to what happened at Lloyd Specialist Developments. So I asked Matt and Mitch to do a compression test, and lo and behold, it had no compression again. Don't think it had zero compression, but it was almost single digit numbers, if I recall. So yeah, off the engine dyno it went, back to EPR. I asked Mitch obviously to check what happened, and he messaged me saying that it had tipped all the exhaust valves. So yet again, because of no piston to valve clearance measurements, the engine had bent a second set of valves. And at this point is when Mitch started raising concerns about the thickness of the heads, saying that they'd been skimmed too much, and that effectively they weren't serviceable. Obviously reminded Mitch, well, hold on, I asked you numerous times, are you happy with these heads? It doesn't make sense importing them if you're not happy with them. So we had a long discussion, which resulted in Mitch offering to provide a set of 40p heads that he'd already CNC machined, that had 1mm oversize Manley pistons in, still had the phosphor bronze guides in, same as what mine did, and then we'd use my Supertech dual core valve springs and the titanium retainers, and you basically replace them like for like, which obviously there was a bit of tweaking that needed doing to make sure that the ports lined up, because I was on a later lower plenum that I'd again paid for porting. My injector adapters were for a later style lower plenum, so that all got sorted. Fair play in that regard. He offered as close to a like for like replacement in a practicable time. Really, could have my 48Ps been repaired by welding the surface up, remachining? Yes, but that would have taken a lot of time. And time was running out. really. I was limited time frame for temporary exports. They can only be out the country for so long, and we were getting close to that deadline. So I needed my engine back, otherwise I was going to get stung with a massive tax bill. So in March, I believe it was, 2021, the engine eventually made its way back onto the engine dyno. We upgraded my Platinum Pro to an Elite 2000. That's effectively the only real changes that were made. Yeah, I can't think of anything else. So yeah, went on the engine dyno. So this time we had electrical problems. The car would only rev up to 5,500 RPM before the Haltech effectively threw in an engine protection or shut down. Can't remember the exact specifics. Matt Paul would remember probably better than me, but yeah, basically it would go into limp mode. It'd shut the ECU down. Matt was working with one of the guys over at Haltech USA. They did a load of trying to fault finding to figure out what the problem was. I think it probably was lacking in earths on the body harness side. I think that seems to be the theory that I think Matt would agree with. But the engine was on the engine dyno for I think 2.5 days in total. Spent a lot of time running. Mitch was happy with how it was running. It only made about 250 horsepower on wastegate pressure, but again, only up to 5,500 RPM. But everything else with the engine in terms of running, everybody else was happy with. We were pretty confident that it was electrical based. It didn't make much sense financially to just keep going with the engine dyno. Obviously you can imagine it was quite expensive. So it was agreed that the engine would be shipped back to me. I'd install it over here and make sure that that problem disappeared. Something else that happened on the engine dyno was Matt noticed the disparity between banks on my O2 sensors. He did a bit of diagnostics with that and found that the issue wasn't the O2 sensors, but it was the WB2 wide pan controller box. Unfortunately, that got missed in the handover. One of those things. Hindsight's a wonderful thing on that one, but hey. So yeah, the engine was sent back to me. Again, Mitch confirmed it had been fully run in. He asked that I do one more oil change on conventional, but the engine had been running. So I plumbed it back in over here and had issues. There's a bit of a theme with this. Got it all up and running, and then noticed quite a significant oil leak coming from the front of the engine. Initially thought it was cam covers again, checked those out, resealed them, still had an oil leak, and then I managed to trace it to the oil galleys that sit on the front of the cylinder heads beneath the where the ends of the camshafts are. So I had to strip the whole front end of the engine. Obviously made Mitch and EPR aware. Stripped the whole front end of the engine, and where Mitch had cleaned out the oil galleys in the heads. So I think from factory they've got a bung in there that he drills out and taps and then puts a grub screw in. He'd used some sort of sealant that hadn't gone off. So it was pouring out of the 4 ports on the front of the engine. How that didn't get spotted on the engine dyno, I don't really know, but it didn't. So I had to fix that, resealed it all up, put the whole front of the engine back on, all the timing, backing plates, timing gear, cam belt, everything back on. And then I think I kind of got it all finished and drivable July 2021. I had a couple of issues with the map that was on the Haltech. There was an issue with long-term fuel trim, short-term fuel trim, that it was causing, the feature wouldn't work. Not that I was particularly looking at using it, but I was going through the functionality of the Haltech, make sure everything was happy. And long-term, short-term fuel trims weren't populating. So I spoke to the same guy that Matt had been speaking to at Haltech USA. He had a look, found there was some sort of corruption with effectively the base map. Matt didn't map the car at all. It was basically run on the Haltech base map that comes with the VG30 or for a VG30, and he didn't do any mapping really. I paid for his setup time in the end rather than for a tuning session. So Haltech basically recreated a new base map for me, but sorted the corruption so everything was working. So yeah, it was July 2021 that the car was kind of drivable. I'd finished, I was doing loads of other work, restoration work to the car. You'll probably see it on my Instagram feed. I'll give a shout out to that later. So yeah, I drove the car around on basically doing kind of running in, but staying away from boost. I wasn't confident that, even though Haltech had redone a base map for me, I didn't really want to get it into boost. I didn't want to risk it. So I put about 1,000 miles on the car, give or take, driving it around the local area, you know, doing everything you're meant to do on running in, not sat on a motorway or interstate at fixed RPM. Did everything that you were supposed to do. So the engine came back still with the maximum running in oil in it. So I used that for a period of time, and then I put in some Fuchs 1550 conventional oil in, ran that for a bit, and then the soonest I could get the car into the tuner was the 30th of August. So that was Abbey Motorsport that I used. Again, they had Dyno pack. They were more experienced with using the Haltech, especially the Elite. So I decided to use those. This time round, transported the car there, and I had a final oil change onto Fuchs 1550 semi-synthetic. As I was concerned, I'd had a pretty clear instruction from Mitch that you do one more on conventional and then you're good to go synthetic. I was sticking with the 1550 semi. It's an oil I know. Fuchs is a massive brand. It's global. They're on par with Castrol, Valvoline, everybody else. For those that haven't heard of it, if you've heard of Silcoline from the 80s and 90s, that's Fuchs. It's the same brand. It got rebranded. So yeah, took the engine to Abbey. All the usual checks were done. Abbey got it started up fine. Obviously I'd started it up here. I think there's a couple of videos on my Instagram where you're doing kind of calibration startups. Where it sounded pretty good. So yeah, Abbey did all their usual pre-dyno checks, and they also noticed the disparity in the fueling. So they put their Dynapack wideband sensor in the bank, the exhaust of the bank that was showing leaner than it should have been. And they were kind of, so as much as we were logging both, they were paying attention to both the wideband readings on the Haltech, but also the wideband readings on the Dyno. They were happy to continue, so I was happy to continue. They started making runs. I can't remember how many runs we did in total. 20 to 30 runs, obviously starting low and building up. Every run, oil pressure was really good, 108 psi at the top end. At idle, I think it was sitting around the 35 psi at idle. And then on the final run, it made 520 horsepower at the hubs. But at the top end, the oil pressure dropped down to 98 psi. And then when he completed the run down to idle, oil pressure dropped down as low as 10 psi before kind of gathering itself back up and settling in the high teens, low 20s. Can't remember the exact number. And it also appeared to be, so I was in the dyno cell with the car. After the run, sounded like VTC rattle. It was a real tinny, high up rattle. Like those of you that know what VTC rattle sounds like, it sounded like VTC rattle. So we unplugged the VTC solenoids, rattle went away. Then we started another run and instantly the tuner wasn't happy. The engine didn't feel the same. Oil pressure was lower, so we aborted the run. During the whole time, the tuner at Abbey had what we call over here deck cans. So the set of headphones that you wear that you wire into a knock sensor and you put onto the engine so you as the tuner can hear detonation, as well as obviously the Haltech was all set up for the knock sensor. So that was looking out for knock as well. At no point during the dyno was there any sign of knock. Abbey had only started working on the fueling side of the map. I think the car had been on the dyno for, in terms of making runs, maybe 3 hours. Hadn't started with ignition timing, hadn't started with VTC. We're still working our way through the fueling map. I said I was in the dyno cell with the car, no sign of any detonation whatsoever. Nothing to suggest anything was wrong with what was being done with the tuning of the car. But obviously something had gone wrong. So I was pretty gutted. My $20,000 engine had died. I had to go back to work. So Abbey cut open the oil filter for me and found chunks of metal in the bottom of the filter, which obviously was not good. I spoke to Mitch and let him know what happened. Exactly as I've just told you, everything was fine, and then we had an unexpected drop of oil pressure. Mitch theorised that it sounded like a bearing failure. So I got Abbey Motorsport to send off a sample of oil for analysis to make sure that there hadn't been any fuel dilution or anything like that. And I brought the car, had the car transported back here and started the removal process to find out what had gone wrong. I got the oil analysis back and there was nothing untoward. No fuel dilution. All the markers for bearing failure, so copper, tin, lead, I think was on there, all showed failure levels, and everything else was green tick. So everything for pistons, rings, liners, not that this has liners, but block, heads, combustion chamber, all the other metals that are in there were all either zero or a couple of parts per million, all completely within acceptable limits. And then so I got the engine out, pulled the sump off without flipping the engine over, and just full of bearing debris, massive amounts. There's a video again on my Instagram. Flipped it over and then started taking off. I guessed it was probably going to be rod failure because it's a VG. So I took off all the rod caps. They had, in my eyes, obvious debris damage. There was kind of fine scoring lines running through them, but nothing like I'd seen before from like clearance issues on the rods. Took the mains off, and then it was very obvious that main 2 and 3 had completely disassembled, just try not to swear, completely fallen apart. 1 and 4 didn't look too bad. I want to say main bearing 1 had next to nothing on it, like hardly any scrapes on it at all. So I thought this was another warrantable issue. I thought it'd be covered under the warranty. But there's some differences between UK and US consumer law. Over here in the UK, if you supply and fit a part, you as the supplier and fitter have to warranty it on behalf of the manufacturer. While over stateside, part failures are covered by the manufacturer's warranty and not by anybody else, not by the retailer or the fit installer or anything like that. But not knowing this, I put an email together to Mitch to make a warranty claim. But I'd lost all faith in Mitch and EPR. They're one in the same in my eyes, to fix the problem and fix it in a timely manner. I mean, the engine, from the first warranty claim when it got sent off, it was there from January 2020 all the way until 23rd of March 2021. It took longer to fix it than it did to build it in the first place. So I put an offer together basically to Mitch saying, well, this is bearing failure, it's warrantable under the warranty. It doesn't make sense for me to send the engine to you. It's £500-600 shipping, sending the engine across to Texas and then back here. His time of machining, fixing whatever's caused the problem. It didn't make sense. So I put an offer in to Mitch of about $7,000 to buy me out of the warranty. So I could basically, I could get on with it. Mitch refused. He reminded me that the warranty did not cover part failures and it only covered machining and assembly faults. And while sympathetic, basically said, you can send the engine back to me, but obviously you're going to have to pay. I think he offered me a preferential rate, but I was still going to have to pay. I felt pretty hard done by at that, but the warranty was the warranty. Mitch had said he'd done a bit of research and found example on a small box Chevy forum, I think, of a king bearing suffering delamination that was down to manufacture fault. And that was kind of his point of reference. And that's what he believed had happened. I felt like that was a bit convenient. Obviously, it hasn't been a smooth sailing process throughout. And I don't know, it just felt convenient to me that the bearings would just fail. So I decided to investigate. Mitch, in the meantime, offered me a set of bearings and an oil pump that he shipped out as a gesture of goodwill, I suppose. And I started further stripping down the engine, where I found some things that I wouldn't have expected on a $20,000 engine build. First was the surface finish on the block. Some of you might have seen it, I've already posted it. Bearing in mind I was using 1.5 mil Tommy multi-layer steel head gaskets. Surface finish measured at 100, averaged out at 122 RA. I think at peak we saw was 127 RA. That's quite a coarse finish. I think Tommy, however you want to pronounce it, quote, finer than 50 RA. Again, I posted that email. So that was quite concerning. So that inspection of the block surface was done at Surdy, UK. Some of you might have heard of Surdy. They make a lot of machines for machining engines, you know, head skimming, boring, pretty much everything. They're a big company. Also took another machine shop local to me that I hadn't used Surdy before, to get the housing bores checked on the billet mains. Again, recently posted these videos. You'll see them below in my YouTube feed, I suppose you call it. So they measured the main bearings, everything talked up to the numbers that have been provided on the build sheet. And they measured them for me, and as you can see in those videos, everything measured tight by places over 2 thou tight. A couple of the journals were tapered from front to back, so that they were angled, and they were ovaled as well, so they were tighter on the sides than they were on the vertical plane. Took it to Surdy, and they gave me the second opinion. They also measured it and found exactly the same. They'd made some observations as well that you could see in the cross hatching of where it had been honed, that it was a varying depth. Some points it was really fine, and some points it was a bit deeper. That kind of reinforced their belief that, and what the measurements were showing, that nothing was concentric. It was not how it was supposed to be, and what they both believed was the cause of the bearing failure. So I got in contact with King Bearings UK distributor, and arranged for the bearings to be sent off for a failure analysis to see why the bearings had failed. EPR was still going on the theory that it had suffered a manufacturer fault causing delamination. I wanted to see if that was true. So I sent those off. In the meantime, I again contacted Mitch and said, listen, I believe this is a machine and assembly error that's caused this failure. All these measurements are showing that it's wrong. And in fact, when referring to the build sheet, the numbers on the build sheet were impossible. The size of the housing bore and the size of the journals effectively gave a negative clearance. It would have been an interference fit. It didn't make sense. And the build sheet didn't account for the thickness of the bearings. At no point, nowhere on the build sheet is the bearing thickness measured, which I think is a pretty key factor if you're going to come up with your oil clearance numbers. Again, Mitch said, well, no, that's, so I was putting on a voice then. Mitch fobbed me off, basically, gave me a massive reply saying, no, the reason that they're measuring like that is because it's been damaged. That didn't make any sense to me. I don't know how clearances get tighter with metal bashing around inside an engine. It should have expanded, but he still refused to accept that this was a problem caused by him and was something that was covered by the warranty. I shared with him obviously the oil analysis that showed there was nothing wrong there, and I waited for the report back from King Bearings. In the meantime, I then started stripping down the rest of the engine, see what other problems were present. Again, photos I've posted. Found burrs that hadn't been cleaned off from where the CNC porting had been done on the valve stem seals. So there was burrs present there. And then while taking the valve train apart, I had a bit of issue taking one of the valves out and found a spring seat wedged into the side of the valve. I thought that was odd. Checked the rest of the head. All the valve stem seals were present. All 12 valve spring seats were correctly installed in there, and yet I had a 13th one floating around in my head. How it hadn't caused the failure, I don't know, but it had damaged the spring, the titanium retainer, and the valve stem seal got a nick in it as well. Not long after, I got the report back from King that gave a firm conclusion, as I've posted it. They firmly put it down to machining and assembly error has caused the bearings to fail. They measured the crush height of the bearings and found that the bearings had been crushed beyond their designed level, which in the report they said was due to it being over-torqued. I'd also sent something I'd missed. So when I sent the bearings off to King, I sent them everything I had. Photos of the rod bearings, video of the condition of the crankshaft, the oil analysis, the measurements that 2 machine shops had taken that were virtually identical, give or take a 10,000th of an inch difference. A copy of the data log, everything sent King. So they had all the information available to them to make a decision or come to a conclusion as why why this engine had failed, why the bearings had failed. Like I said, they gave a firm conclusion. Improper machine and assembly, big bold letters. So again, I contacted Mitch and said, listen, this is clearly a warrantable issue. I've got the King bearing report that gave a firm conclusion. I've got all these measurements that show that the main bearing, the main journals on the billet mains hadn't been machined properly. Again, a flat refusal. Gave me an apology for the extra spring seat, couldn't account for that as to why that was there, but wouldn't accept responsibility that something that he'd done with the machining of this engine caused failure. Now I did some calculations. Obviously I'd measured the thickness of the bearings. They were standard X. I'd done the calculations with what the bearing thicknesses should have been, and it worked out that I had, give or take a 10,000th either side, 0.0018 thou. So 1 thou and 8 tenths clearance for my main bearing oil clearances, which is pretty much bang on what they came from Nissan with, and suitable for a 300 horsepower engine, not a 600 horsepower engine. While it made 521 at the hubs, over here in the UK we still like flywheel horsepower, and the calculations brought it up. I think it was about 609 horsepower at the crank or at the flywheel. There was a smoking gun in my eyes. I posted on a couple of Facebook pages for engine building and tuning, posted on HB Academy, see if anybody could come up with any other reasons as to why these bearings might have failed, and everybody came back with the same: it's not been machined properly. I'd sent him photos of the pistons and everything else, and said, oh, he could see damage on the side of the piston crowns, which was nothing but carbon build-up. Wiped clean off, sent in photos again. I've seen deck damage on pistons. I'm sure some of you have. There was no deck damage at all. No needling on the top, nothing down the side of the crowns. The rings weren't pinched. No physical evidence of deck damage. Spark plugs were fine. But that's the hook he was hanging his hat on. That he was blaming detonation damage that hadn't killed the rod bearings, but had killed the main bearings. So at that point, I said, no, I'm not happy. I want a refund. There's clear evidence to suggest that proves that this is your fault. I expect a refund, of which my request was denied. So at that point, I had to get legal involved. So I found an attorney who was willing to take on the case based on the evidence that I had. If any of you have been involved in a similar situation, you find attorneys don't like taking on cases like this. They're not the easiest to prove, but due to the investigation I'd done, all the documents and the measurements, and obviously I'd kept every message, every email between myself and EPR, attorney was happy to take the case on. So we sent a demand letter to EPR stating our case and giving him two sums to refund. One was effectively a full refund, plus some of the other expenses I'd incurred doing my investigation. And one was effectively the cost to rebuild the engine as it is, and again, plus some additional damages that I'd incurred, or costs that I'd incurred. So we got a reply from Mitch's attorney denying responsibility. Again, we contacted them again with further evidence, and that was ignored. So on January 2023 now, we initiated legal proceedings and lodged a case with Johnson County Court. All the stuff that goes along with that. And we got to April 24, where we had to have court-ordered mediation. I had my figure, and was confident in the evidence I had to be able to prove on balance of probability. In fact, I think I had enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this was a machine and assembly error that should have been covered by the warranty. Mitch gave me an offer of initially $1,000 plus signing an NDA, which I rejected. Then made an improved offer of $5,000 plus paid over 6 months plus an NDA. I rejected that. So yeah, we ended up at court 4th of June 2024. So what, 6 years after the initial contracting of the engine, we're in court, and it was a 5-day process. I think the actual trial itself was 4 days spread over that 5-day process. And that resulted in a unanimous verdict by the jury in my favour. They attributed 100% of blame to EPR for breach of warranty. They also found in my favour for breach of contract, but because of some confusion over the jury instructions, they didn't award damages. So while they did find against EPR and Mitch for breach of contract, because they didn't award damages, it doesn't technically go down on the judgment. And here I am. Where are we? March 2025. The judgment got signed off in September 24. So we've made a couple of demands for payment from EPR. Been ignored. So I'm here 9 months after the verdict, 6 months after the judgment, which I won't give you the exact number, but they awarded me effectively a refund plus a bit as compensation. I was happy with the amount that was awarded. I don't think it's not an astronomical sum. I think it's a fair sum. And EPR avoiding payment. I'm stuck here with no engine. My financial situation, obviously everyone's different, but I'm kind of in a position where I can't afford to rebuild this engine at the moment. The damage is throughout the engine. It killed the bearing debris damage has killed my turbos. They've got a load of shaft play in them now. Cylinder heads, the cam journals have all got scoring. I'm hoping they're salvageable. And EPR are refusing to pay a court-ordered judgment to me. I mean, I've made a note of how's it affected me. I mean, apart from the financial loss, I think I missed out on the National Classic Car Show at the NEC, which is a massive car show over here. It's not like SEMA, but it's a pretty big car show. Twice this car should have been on the 300ZX stand. Once in 2019, just after the first engine failure. And once again in 2021. Again, couldn't go because of engine failure. So, I mean, the exposure of my car, I'm not a social media personality, I'm just a normal dude. I'm not a content creator, state of this video. But it's nice to get recognition. I've put a lot of time, effort and money into this car. It is my absolute pride of joy. My kids have missed out the same load of you. I got into cars because spending time with my dad in cars, my stepdad in cars. As a kid, it fueled my passion for it, and I can't do that with my own kids. My youngest is desperate to go out in it. He's always asking when you're getting your money to be able to fix your car. I can't do it. It kind of breaks my heart, to be honest. And stress, this has been up there with one of the most stressful experiences I've ever had. Just dealing, obviously, with EPR's refusal to accept responsibility for something that's clearly their fault. It's dealing with the legal system of a different country. I mean, like for the trial, I flew out there, was out there for a week off. I don't get any of that money back. That cost me a couple of thousand in hotel fees, flights, obviously food and drink, just living out there in a hotel room on my own for a week. And the stress that went along with that. It's not an experience I'd wish on anybody. If you're a prospective customer of EPR, think twice. If this doesn't give you an idea about how they conduct their business, I don't know what does. So yeah, at the moment, this will stay as you see it, without an engine. I will keep fighting because I've come this far. I can't give up now. I know this has been long. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I've probably missed some bits out, even with my notes. Yeah, I'll still be on the Facebook pages, on Instagram, which reminds me. Instagram account, I kind of have one specifically for my car that's away from my personal account that's got all my family stuff on. So it's nightfury_Z32. My eldest at the time, I think she was 7, thought my car looked like Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon. So that's where it got its name from, as Night Fury. So yeah, I'll be posting a lot of stuff on Instagram. Threads, I've just kind of started with. and I'll post on my Facebook pages. I'm going to post the transcript for the court case, so that will be in the description below, in a Dropbox, which will have the transcript from every day where the trial took place. I won't include any of like the legal arguments or the jury selection stuff, purely the evidence that was offered to the jury that led to them getting their decision. You can read it yourself, you can make your own mind up. What matters to me is I have a court judgment that says EPR breached their express warranty and breached their contract for me. Everything else is conjecture. Cheers, take care.